The agenda this week caught up on the UN's climate conference and spoke to investigative journalist Tanya Talaga about the tragedy that is Indigenous youth suicide. The agenda's week in review begins with the legislature's special committee investigating the previous Liberal government's spending practices. We heard the Premier off the top say a lot of Liberals got rich, really, really rich under Kathleen Wynne and off the backs of the taxpayers of Ontario. That's what he said. There's now been 3 months of committee hearings. Do we know whether that's true?
Well, no, well, we don't know that that's true. And what we've said, not to Ross so much, but to the ministers involved, we've said, great, if this is a crime, who is calling the police? And they haven't called the police. And remember, the Tories said we're not shy about calling the police on the gas plants debacle when the Liberals are in power and on other Liberal scandals. They haven't called the police on this one because no crime has been committed. It's an accounting dispute.
Ross, would you agree that no crime's been committed here and this was a bit of political overreach?
I don't think it was political overreach. I look back to, again, we had a government, former government, that was reduced to 7 seats in the House. The people of Ontario spoke loud and clear in the election. They did not trust the former government. They did not trust the accounting. They did not trust the numbers. We had a deficit that we were told was $6.7 billion last year. It turns out that it was in excess of $12 to $15 billion.
But the suggestion is that there was criminal malfeasance involved here. Well, that was the very strong suggestion. Is that the case?
I can certainly tell you that we know who didn't get rich, and it's the ratepayers and the taxpayers of Ontario. They certainly did not get rich off this former government. They certainly had a lot of questions, and this committee ultimately had the unanimous approval of everyone in the House. Everyone who attended on that day to vote voted in favor of the motion to create this committee with the mandate that we had.
Okay. Have you seen criminal malfeasance as a result of your investigation?
Absolutely not. And that is a question that I put to almost every witness, specifically the idea that the Liberals got rich off of this. I mean, those are high accusations that come from the Premier, and that set the tone, as I said earlier, for the committee. So I wanted to clear the air with each witness. Let's get the elephant in the room out, and were people enriched by this? And not one single witness agreed that that was the case. And so what I'm saying is that this speaks to the idea that this was this a really genuine and meaningful effort to understand what had happened? There is no doubt that the Liberals, the way that they borrowed money, that scheme, as it's been called, was unpopular with the electorate. I mean, they were reduced to 7 seats. It was unpopular. It was a political, partisan strategy that failed miserably. But this government, by trying to say that it was political, that it was beyond political, that it was in fact criminal, sets the tone for the kind of dialogue that we're having, not only in this committee, but the kind of dialogue that we're having in the House. I mean, we have, people of Ontario have very serious concerns about continuing to be, that their hydro continues to be unaffordable. We have the people that are concerned about losing their jobs. We have what's happened in Oshawa. There's people that are still waiting in hallways in terms of the health care that they're receiving. And so this committee has spent a lot of time, a lot of energy trying to get to the bottom of something that was not, wasn't criminal. And in fact, the way that witnesses have been blocked and questions have been overruled by the majority on the committee has prevented us from actually getting to some issues of substance.
Let's start with some background. How did you get so interested in the intersection between climate change and health?
So I'm an emergency doctor, and I wanted to work with Doctors Without Borders. And when you want to work with Doctors Without Borders, they say, okay, you're Canadian, go to the north. So I went to the north, and I was on my way up for a locum in December, and I needed some reading material because it's quiet there in December, and it's good to have something to read. And so I bought a book on climate change, actually, on my way up through the Edmonton airport, and I had a fair bit of time to read it. And by the time I was done, I was like, oh my gosh. And it just turned out that was just a little while after the Lancet had put out a report saying that climate change was the biggest health threat of the 21st century. So I was actually by myself in Inuvik doing a literature review. And it turns out when you ask around that Inuvik is already 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in the 1950s. And so people are having trouble. Ice is less stable, so it's more difficult to hunt for food. People are more likely to go through the ice, so there's the potential for trauma. And the rapidly changing landscape, it's upsetting if you can imagine growing up in a place that looked one way and then, the permafrost starts to melt on inclines, so they're getting landslides. trees, they're called drunken forests, where the permafrost sort of melts a little bit and the roots from the tree kind of soften and the trees tip over.
Well, you didn't grow
So
up there,
things-
but you live in Yellowknife now.
Yeah,
so
these
you
are the
see all this
stories.
now.
Yeah, these are the stories that people hear you tell you. So, you know, as an Emerge doc, you speak with everybody coming in, and sometimes you have time while you're suturing someone up, and they just, you know, you say, hey, what did you do last week? And they said, oh, I went hunting where my father has always had his traps, and, you know, the lake's not actually frozen there the way they usually are, and, you know, things are changing a lot. So particularly our Indigenous population who's been up there for millennia and have strong oral traditions letting us know what has happened previously, they've really noted changes, and that's been backed up since by research.
Okay, let me read this tweet here. This is from Catherine McKenna, the Minister of the Environment for Canada, and she had the following to say. We are the first generation to broadly experience the impacts of climate change. We are the first generation to understand the solutions and have a commitment to each do our part. We are the last generation who can prevent the worst effects. So let's do it. Hashtag COP24. On the other side, you have some in the environmental movement, for example, Bill McKibben, author of The End of Nature, who says that the annual COP meetings are not worth the effort because they, quote, produce insufficient results too slowly at a time when rapid action is demanded. What's your take on his sentiments?
So first of all, I think Catherine McKenna is right. You know, I spend as much work on this as I do because I'm an emergency doctor and I'm trained to respond in a timely manner to quick-moving disease. And I have been in the situation where I have done that, and I have taken somebody who had unstable physiology and managed to sort of pull them back into a place where they were stable. And
it's a nice metaphor for what you have to do right now.
Well, and it's actually very visceral. There are a lot of Emerge docs actually increasingly becoming involved in this, and I think it's because we've all also unfortunately had the opposite experience, which is of having somebody semi-stable and then having them essentially as one organ system shuts down and then the next organ system shuts down and the next organ system shuts down.
They crash.
Yeah, exactly. So even if you give the same treatment that you could have given 5 minutes ago and it would have worked, if that's already started to happen, they just spiral out of your control and it doesn't matter what you've
And that metaphor works for the planet as well.
It feels like it is apt, yeah. And so those of us who spend our lives resuscitating biological systems are very, very, we're unable to actually sit still right now because there's such a sense that the physiology of the planet is becoming unstable. So yes, it is time for us to act as urgently as we possibly can. This is a code blue for the planet. We need to walk quickly to the site of trouble, and we need to have clear leadership. We need to have a clear plan that we communicate to everybody, and we need to take action in a sustained way.
Let's tell some of these, I'm afraid, rather harrowing stories that you do tell in the book and through the course of your lectures. And I want to start with, this is even hard to talk about, a youth suicide pact. Well, all right, but rather than me fill in some of the background, why don't you just tell the story?
This is a story of, it is what has happened to 7 girls, 7 young girls, age 12, 13, 14, who died by suicide over the last couple of years. This happened in 2 communities. The girls are from 2 communities in particular, Wapakika First Nation and Poplar Hill First Nation. Both of those communities are about 600 kilometers northwest of Thunder Bay. They are fly-in communities, so that means they're very difficult to access. They're smaller communities too. Both of them don't have doctors. They don't have a large mental health staff in the communities. They don't have high schools in their communities. They're fly in, fly out if you want to access all of these services. The 7 girls all met they were friends. They knew each other. Most of them met actually when they were in the South, where they were in the Ottawa area receiving care because they were all in crisis. It was at some point they kept in contact through social media that they devised this pact. All the girls were in various levels of trauma, as you can imagine. I mean, that's why you would do something like that. And it was the leaders of Wapakika First Nation that first noticed what was happening, and they actually discovered the pact before some of the girls died. They reached out to the federal government because, as you know, the federal government is in charge of healthcare spending dollars for all First Nations communities. They asked the federal government for emergency health care funding for $386,000 in order to pay for 4 mental health workers that could come to the community straight away to help them dealing with the crisis because they had found a pact. And sadly, the Health Canada refused the request, the urgent request.
Because?
They said it was an awkward time in the budgetary cycle. As a result of that, cascading failures, 2 girls died. And then more girls died. It continues to be something that is just absolutely horrific in those communities. I mean, when you're talking about a community of 300, 400, 500, 600 people, the loss of one child is remarkable. Everybody feels it. Everybody knows. And it wasn't just also, too, that the girls were in crisis. When they died, all of the other youth in the community also went into crisis, and they had to be monitored right away. And what Canada has done constantly is fly in people. Instead of having something permanent there that is in the community, so the girls can be treated with their families in the community, people fly in and fly out. And that's the nut of it. They fly out. They fly in, and then they leave. This is not what First Nations communities need. And First Nations communities know what they need, and they need to be in control of their own healthcare spending dollars so they don't have to go begging or asking the federal government for help every time there's a crisis.
You do quote a physician in your book, Mike Curlew, I think is how he says his name, works in Sioux Lookout in Northern Ontario, and he says the system isn't broken, it is designed to do what it is doing. What did he mean by that?
Well, he means that the Canadian healthcare system was never designed for First Nations people or their needs in mind, ever.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review for this Friday, December 21st, 2018. You can see all of those conversations in their entirety on our website, tvo.org, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, and on our Twitter feed. That's twitter.com/theagenda.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.